Okay, class, usually I don't like to use PowerPoints, but for this one I'd like to show a couple slides at least. We're going to start covering Chapter 7 here. We're going to start covering handling exceptions and validating data. I'll try to split it up into two videos. The first video, this one, excuse me, will cover handling exceptions and what are exceptions. In the next video, we'll cover defensive coding techniques and how we can refrain from throwing exceptions and maybe how to handle it in a better way than throwing exceptions. So that being said, you can read through the objectives yourself if you'd like. Here is the dialog box for an unhandled exception. So you've probably seen this before in your Java class or even maybe in this class so far. You've definitely seen it if you've been watching my videos, as I've ran into a couple exceptions I've had to fix. But exceptions are points in your code that the compiler didn't necessarily expect. So the compiler or the IDE puts a lot of faith in your hands that you know what you're doing. And sometimes if maybe on accident you do something or the user does something or something happens outside of your control that the program crashes, then it's going to throw an exception. Here's a format exception here. So for example, somebody probably put something in this text box that wasn't a decimal, so they were unable to parse it. Here is the exception hierarchy for 5 common exceptions. So here's like an arithmetic exception. So you might be trying to divide by 0 and you can't, or you might have an overflow exception. So the number might be too large for its memory capacity. A format exception, just like you saw before. There's also many other types of exceptions that I believe this PowerPoint gets into. So it might not be worth me getting into here. Okay, well anyways, there's other sorts of all kinds of exceptions. There's SQL exceptions, so maybe you're unable to connect to a SQL database. Maybe the database is down, the server is down, whatever the case may be. There's arithmetic exceptions. So there's exceptions for just about everything. You can look in the MSDN documentation or in the book. Here's methods that might throw an exception. So we've already came across this convert. If you're trying to convert to a decimal, it could throw an exception. The convert to integer, kind of the same thing. So a lot of things can throw exceptions if you're not careful. So I think that's about it that I wanted to cover for this PowerPoint. We'll get into more of this PowerPoint in the next video. But I'm going to actually take you into the code and show you how we look for exceptions and how we handle them in the code. So I did jump back to my, which application is this? I named it our first Windows Form application, but this is the invoice total application. So this is where we put in the total for our invoice, and it calculates a discount percent, a discount amount, and a total. So here's where if we put in garbage to this text box and hit calculate, I handled it in such a way where it didn't throw an exception. I just made it a 0. I think it's because I used the try parse method. Yeah. So let's change this try parse method back to the convert. Alright, so now we have a subtotal that's using this convert method, and we've seen in the PowerPoint that this can throw an exception if you don't handle what the user puts in this text box. So let's put in garbage, click calculate, and we see that we get this format exception. The input string was not in the correct format. So we expected a decimal and you gave us text. You can see here's the text. So how can we handle that a little bit better? Because if this were a program that were in production, we would come across this code and it would the program would crash. Anything I was doing in my program, I would lose, and I'd have to start all over again. I wouldn't be a very happy camper. It might have been my fault. I didn't put something in that case in the correct format, but I still wouldn't expect to lose my work. I would expect some sort of maybe dialog box to pop up to say, hey, you didn't put in the correct information, or I couldn't handle what you put in. So C# allows us to have a message box, so we'll be using that. But what we can do, if you remember back in Java, we can actually wrap anything that might, let me put this in a region. That way we don't have to look at this try-catch, or this switch case. Alright, there we go. Let's go ahead and make this full screen. And I want to wrap everything that could throw an exception. I want to wrap it in a try-catch. So I'm going to hit try, I'm going to hit tab twice. And now, here's my calculate %, but really the only thing, I'm just going to go ahead and throw this all in the try-catch. So I know this convert to decimal can throw an exception. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap that in a try-catch, and this is saying, hey, I know this can throw an exception, and I want to catch it before it happens. So now when I catch it, I want to give my exception a name, in this case E. And if something happens, I want to throw up a message box, messagebox.show. Please enter a valid number for your subtotal field. I want to give the message box a name. So now you can hit F5 to run it. Here's our application. I'm going to type in some garbage, click calculate, and you can see now a message box pops up. So the compiler went here and it noticed that it was going to encounter a format exception, so it came down here to the exception block and it threw up a message box and it got out before the program crashed. So it's a little bit better user experience than just blowing up and losing everything that you had. Excuse me. Another thing that we can do is if you're developing locally and you want to just be able to see what happened, you can actually look at what is in this exception. So I gave it a name. I'm going to say messagebox.show again. And I want to show the message that was in the exception. And I want to give it a couple new lines. So I'm going to concatenate this string together. I want to get the type of exception and format it as a string so I can display it. A couple more lines. Then I want to show the stack trace. So what the stack trace is it's going to tell us exactly what was called and in what order to throw this exception. So if you notice that it has this stack on it, and if you know much about data structures and algorithms, you know that a stack, you put something on top and it's last in, first out. So the last thing that went in is the first thing to come out. So the thing that's on top will be the last thing that was called. So it should tell us exactly which method threw the exception, so it's easier to find if maybe you had a lot of code you're trying to go through. So let's go to the subtotal field and let's type in garbage and hit calculate. And now we have an exception that gives us a little bit of information as to what happened. We know that the input string was not in the correct format. We know that a format exception was thrown. And we know around about where it started. We knew that it was in our first Windows Forms applications button calculate click event at line 41. So if we go back and look at line 41, we know it happened right here. So our program didn't crash, but it still gave us enough helpful information to know exactly where we had to go to figure out what went wrong. So that's at a high level what the try-catch is going to give to us. So you notice that we didn't really catch any sort of specific exception, we just catched the most generic of exceptions. But you can have multiple catch statements here, and you always want to catch the most specific exception first, because it goes and looks at the try-catch statement, or looks at the catch statements and tries to decipher which block of code to execute. And it's going to look at the first one first, the second one second, etc., etc. So we're going to go ahead and put another catch in here. And I want to catch the format exception. And then if it catches the format exception, I want to throw up another message box. And I want to show the message of my exception. Why doesn't it like this? Oh, because I have this event args e, so it has to be named something else. Alright, so now we're catching a more specific exception, the format exception. So it should do something a little bit different. It should just give us the message and the exception, because we already know what type of exception it is. So let's hit F5 and run it. And I should get a format exception, and here my input string was not in the correct format. So we know that it went through this block because all it gave me was just the message. It didn't give me the entire stack trace, the type, and everything like that. So it's always good, if you know which type of exception you're looking for, to explicitly state the exception here. And if you look at the MSDN documentation, you can see all of the hundreds of exceptions that can be thrown.